Australia, Wikipedia. Australia, officially the Commonwealth of Australia, 16 is a sovereign country comprising the mainland of the Australian continent, the island of Tasmania, and numerous smaller islands. 17 Australia is the largest country by area in Oceania and the world's sixth largest country. Australia is the oldest, 18 flattest, 19 and driest inhabited continent, 2021 with the least fertile soils. 22-23 It is a megadiverse country, and its size gives it a wide variety of landscapes and climates, with deserts in the center, tropical rainforests in the northeast, tropical savannas in the north, and mountain ranges in the southeast. Commonwealth of Australia. Flag. Coat of arms. Daha Az Goster. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians began arriving from Southeast Asia 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, during the last glacial period. 24, 25, 26 Arriving by sea, they settled the continent and had formed approximately 250 distinct language groups by the time of European settlement, maintaining some of the longest known continuing artistic and religious traditions in the world. 27 Australia's written history commenced with the European maritime exploration of Australia. The Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon was the first known European to reach Australia, in 1606. In 1770, the British explorer James Cook mapped and claimed the east coast of Australia for Great Britain, and the first fleet of British ships arrived at Sydney in 1788 to establish the penal colony of New South Wales. The European population grew in subsequent decades, and by the end of the 1850s gold rush, most of the continent had been explored by European settlers and an additional 5 self-governing British colonies were established. Democratic parliaments were gradually established through the 19th century, culminating with a vote for the Federation of the Six Colonies and foundation of the Commonwealth of Australia on 1 January 1901. 28 This began a process of increasing autonomy from the United Kingdom, highlighted by the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act 1942, and culminating in the Australia Act 1986. 28. Australia is a federal parliamentary constitutional monarchy, comprising 6 states and 10 territories. Australia's population of nearly 27 million is highly urbanized and heavily concentrated on the eastern seaboard. 29 Canberra is the nation's capital, while its most populous cities are Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide. 30 It is ethnically diverse and multicultural, the product of large-scale immigration, with almost half of the population having at least one parent born overseas. 31 Australia's abundant natural resources and well-developed international trade relations are crucial to the country's economy, which generates its income from various sources including services, mining exports, banking, manufacturing, agriculture and international education. 32, 33, 34 Australia ranks highly for quality of life, health, education, economic freedom, civil liberties and political rights. 35. The name Australia, pronounced Strali in Australian English 40, is derived from the Latin terra australis, southern land, a name used for a hypothetical continent in the southern hemisphere since ancient times. 41 Several 16th century cartographers used the word Australia on maps, but not to identify modern Australia. 42 When Europeans began visiting and mapping Australia in the 17th century, the name Terra Australis was naturally applied to the new territories. N6. Until the early 19th century, Australia was best known as New Holland, a name first applied by the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1644, as New Holland and subsequently anglicized. Terra Australis still saw occasional usage, such as in scientific texts. N7 The name Australia was popularized by the explorer Matthew Flinders, who said it was more agreeable to the ear, and an assimilation to the names of the other great portions of the earth. 48 The first time that Australia appears to have been officially used was in April 1817, when Governor Lachlan Macquarie acknowledged the receipt of Flinders' charts of Australia from Lord Bathurst. 49 In December 1817, Macquarie recommended to the Colonial Office that it be formally adopted. 50 In 1824, the Admiralty agreed that the continent should be known officially by that name. 51 The first official published use of the new name came with the publication in 1830 of the Australia Directory by the Hydrographic Office. 52. Colloquial names for Australia include Oz and the land down under, usually shortened to just down under. Other epithets include the Great Southern Land, the Lucky Country, the Sunburnt Country, and the Wide Brown Land. The latter two both derive from Dorothea Mackellar's 1908 poem, My Country. 53. Aboriginal rock art in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. Indigenous Australians comprise 2 broad groups, the Aboriginal peoples of the Australian mainland and surrounding islands including Tasmania and the Torres Strait Islanders, who are a distinct Melanesian people. Human habitation of the Australian continent is estimated to have begun 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, 24, 54, 55, 25, with the migration of people by land bridges and short sea crossings from what is now Southeast Asia. 56 It is uncertain how many waves of immigration may have contributed to these ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians. 57-58 The Madjedbeeb Rock Shelter in Arnhem Land is recognized as the oldest site showing the presence of humans in Australia. 59. The oldest human remains found are the Lake Mungo remains, which have been dated to around 41,000 years ago. 60. 61. Aboriginal Australian culture is one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. 62. At the time of first European contact, Aboriginal Australians were complex hunter-gatherers with diverse economies and societies and about 250 different language groups. 63. 64. Recent archaeological finds suggest that a population of 750,000 could have been sustained. 65. 66. Aboriginal Australians have an oral culture with spiritual values based on reverence for the land and a belief in the dreamtime. 67. The Torres Strait Islander people first settled their islands around 4,000 years ago. 68. Culturally and linguistically distinct from mainland Aboriginal peoples, they were seafarers and obtained their livelihood from seasonal horticulture and the resources of their reefs and seas. 69. Makassar fishermen from what is now Indonesia visited the coast of northern Australia around the middle of the 18th century, first in the Kimberley region and some decades later in Arnhem Land. 70. 71. 72. Landing of James Cook at Botany Bay on the 29th of April 1770 to claim Australia's east coast for Great Britain. The first recorded European sighting of the Australian mainland, and the first recorded European landfall on the Australian continent, are attributed to the Dutch. 73. The first ship and crew to chart the Australian coast and meet with Aboriginal people was the Dyfken, captained by Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon. 74. He sighted the coast of Cape York Peninsula in early 1606, and made landfall on the 26th of February 1606 at the Penfather River near the modern town of Weipa on Cape York. 75. Later that year, Spanish explorer Luis Vaz de Torres sailed through and navigated the Torres Strait Islands. 76. The Dutch charted the whole of the western and northern coastlines and named the island continent, New Holland, during the 17th century, and although no attempt at settlement was made. 75. A number of shipwrecks left men either stranded or, as in the case of the Batavia in 1629, marooned for mutiny and murder, thus becoming the first Europeans to permanently inhabit the continent. 77. In 1770, Captain James Cook sailed along and mapped the east coast, which he named New South Wales, and claimed for Great Britain. 78. Following the loss of its American colonies in 1783, the British government sent a fleet of ships, the First Fleet, under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, to establish a new penal colony in New South Wales. A camp was set up and the Union flag raised at Sydney Cove, Port Jackson, on the 26th of January 1788, 7980, a date which later became Australia's National Day. Most early convicts were transported for petty crimes and assigned as labourers or servants to free settlers, non-convict immigrants. While the majority of convicts settled into colonial society once emancipated, convict rebellions and uprisings were also staged, but invariably suppressed under martial law. The 1808 Rum Rebellion, the only successful armed takeover of government in Australia, instigated a 2-year period of military rule. 81. The following decade, social and economic reforms initiated by Governor Lachlan Macquarie saw New South Wales transition from a penal colony to a civil society. 82. 83. The indigenous population declined for 150 years following settlement, mainly due to infectious disease. 84. Thousands more died as a result of frontier conflict with settlers. 85. Tasmania's Port Arthur Penal Settlement is one of 11 UNESCO World Heritage listed Australian convict sites. The British continued to push into other areas of the continent in the early 19th century, initially along the coast. In 1803, a settlement was established in Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania. 86, and in 1813, Gregory Blacksland, William Lawson and William Wentworth crossed the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, opening the interior to European settlement. 87. The British claim extended to the whole Australian continent in 1827 when Major Edmund Lockyer established a settlement on King George Sound, modern-day Albany. 88. The Swan River Colony, present-day Perth, was established in 1829, evolving into the largest Australian colony by area, Western Australia. 89. In accordance with population growth, separate colonies were carved from New South Wales, Tasmania in 1825, South Australia in 1836, New Zealand in 1841, Victoria in 1851, and Queensland in 1859. 90. South Australia was founded as a free province, it was never a penal colony. 91. Western Australia was also founded free, but later accepted. Transported convicts, the last of which arrived in 1868, decades after transportation had ceased to the other colonies. 92. In 1823, a legislative council nominated by the Governor of New South Wales was established, together with a new Supreme Court, thus limiting the powers of colonial governors. 93. Between 1855 and 1890, the 6 colonies individually gained responsible government, thus becoming elective democracies managing most of their own affairs while remaining part of the British Empire. 94. The Colonial Office in London retained control of some matters, notably foreign affairs. 95. And defence. 96. South Australia became the first electorate in the world to grant men and women equal political rights, equally franchising all adults to vote and run for parliament from 1895. 97. In the mid-19th century, explorers such as Burke and Wills went further inland to determine its agricultural potential and answer scientific questions. 98. A series of gold rushes beginning in the early 1850s led to an influx of new migrants from China, North America and continental Europe. 99. As well as outbreaks of bushranging and civil unrest, the latter peaked in 1854 when Ballarat miners launched the Eureka Rebellion against gold license fees. 100. From the 1850s a number of colonists such as William Wentworth, John Dunmore Lang and Sir Henry Parkes began to articulate ideas for an association or union of the Australian colonies. 101. From 1886, Australian colonial governments began introducing policies resulting in the removal of many Aboriginal children from their families and communities referred to as the Stolen Generations. 102. The Big Picture, a painting by on the 1st of January 1901, Federation of the Colonies was achieved after a decade of planning, constitutional conventions and referendums, resulting in the establishment of the Commonwealth of Australia as a nation and the entering into force of the Australian Constitution. 103. After the 1907 Imperial Conference, Australia and several other self-governing British settler colonies were given the status of self-governing dominions within the British Empire. 104-105 Australia was one of the founding members of the League of Nations in 1920, 106 and subsequently of the United Nations in 1945. 107 Britain's Statute of Westminster 1931 formally ended most of the constitutional links between Australia and the United Kingdom. Australia adopted it in 1942, 108 but it was backdated to 1939 to confirm the validity of legislation passed by the Australian Parliament during World War II. 109-110 The Federal Capital Territory, later renamed the Australian Capital Territory, was formed in 1911 as the location for the future federal capital of Canberra. Melbourne was the temporary seat of government from 1901 to 1927 while Canberra was being constructed. 111 The Northern Territory was transferred from the control of the South Australian government to the federal parliament in 1911. 112 Australia became the colonial ruler of the territory of Papua, which had initially been annexed by Queensland in 1883, 113 in 1902 and of the territory of New Guinea, formerly German New Guinea, in 1920. The two were unified as the territory of Papua and New Guinea in 1949 and gained independence from Australia in 1975. 114, 115, 116 In 1914, Australia joined the Allies in fighting the First World War, and took part in many of the major battles fought on the Western Front. 117 Of about 416,000 who served, about 60,000 were killed and another 152,000 were wounded. 118 Many Australians regard the defeat of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps Anzacs at Gallipoli in 1915 as the nation's baptism of fire, its first major military action. 119-120 With the anniversary of the landing at Anzac Cove commemorated each year on Anzac Day. 121 From 1939 to 1945, Australia joined the Allies in fighting the Second World War. Australia's armed forces fought in the Pacific, European and Mediterranean and Middle East theaters. 122-123 The shock of Britain's defeat in Asia in 1942, followed soon after by the bombing of Darwin and other Japanese attacks on Australian soil, led to a widespread belief in Australia that a Japanese invasion was imminent, and a shift from the United Kingdom to the United States as Australia's principal ally and security partner. 124 Since 1951, Australia has been a formal military ally of the United States, under the ANZUS Treaty. 125 Post-war migrants from Europe arriving in Australia in 1954. In the decades following World War II, Australia enjoyed significant increases in living standards, leisure time and suburban development. 126-127 Using the slogan, "Populate or Perish," the nation encouraged a large wave of immigration from across Europe, with such immigrants referred to as New Australians. 128 A member of the Western Bloc during the Cold War, Australia participated in the Korean War and the Malayan Emergency during the 1950s and the Vietnam War from 1962 to 1972. 129 During this time, tensions over communist influence in society led to unsuccessful attempts by the Menzies government to ban the Communist Party of Australia, 130 and a bitter splitting of the Labour Party in 1955. 131 As a result of a 1967 referendum, the federal government received a mandate to implement policies to benefit Aboriginal people, and all Indigenous Australians were included in the census. 132 Traditional ownership of land native title was recognised in law for the first time when the High Court of Australia held in Mabo v Queensland No. 2 that the legal doctrine of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, did not apply to Australia at the time of European settlement. 133 Following the final abolition of the White Australia policy in 1973, 134 Australia's demography and culture transformed as a result of a large and ongoing wave of non-European immigration, mostly from Asia. 135-136 The late 20th century also saw an increasing focus on foreign policy ties with other Pacific Rim nations. 137 While the Australia Act 1986 severed the remaining vestigial constitutional ties between Australia and the United Kingdom, 138 A 1999 referendum resulted in 55% of voters rejecting a proposal to abolish the monarchy of Australia and become a republic. 139 Following the September 11 attacks on the United States, Australia joined the United States in fighting the Afghanistan War from 2001 to 2021 and the Iraq War from 2003 to 2009. 140 The nation's trade relations also became increasingly oriented towards East Asia in the 21st century, with China becoming the nation's largest trading partner by a large margin. 141. During the COVID-19 pandemic which commenced in Australia in 2020, several of Australia's largest cities were locked down for extended periods of time, and free movement across state borders was restricted in an attempt to slow the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. 142. General characteristics. Topographic map of Australia. Dark green represents the lowest elevation and dark brown the highest. Surrounded by the Indian and Pacific Oceans, N8 Australia is separated from Asia by the Arafura and Timor Seas, with the Coral Sea lying off the Queensland coast, and the Tasman Sea lying between Australia and New Zealand. The world's smallest continent 144 and sixth largest country by total area, 145 Australia, owing to its size and isolation, is often dubbed the island continent, 146 and is sometimes considered the world's largest island. 147 Australia has 34,218 kilometers 21,262 miles of coastline excluding all offshore islands 148 and claims an extensive exclusive economic zone of 8,148,250 square kilometers 3,146,060 square miles. This exclusive economic zone does not include the Australian Antarctic Territory. 149. Mainland Australia lies between latitudes 9 degrees and 44 degrees south, and longitudes 112 degrees and 154 degrees east. 150 Australia's size gives it a wide variety of landscapes, with tropical rainforests in the northeast, mountain ranges in the southeast, southwest and east, and desert in the center. 151 The desert or semi-arid land commonly known as the outback makes up by far the largest portion of land. 152 Australia is the driest inhabited continent, its annual rainfall averaged over continental area is less than 500 millimeters. 153 The population density is 3.4 inhabitants per square kilometer, although the large majority of the population lives along the temperate southeastern coastline. The population density exceeds 19,500 inhabitants per square kilometer in central Melbourne. 154 In 2021 Australia had 10% of the global permanent meadows and pastureland. 155 Fitzroy Island, one of the 600 islands within the main archipelago of the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest coral reef, 156 lies a short distance off the northeast coast and extends for over 2,000 kilometers 1,200 miles. Mount Augustus, claimed to be the world's largest monolith, 157, is located in Western Australia. At 2,228 meters 7,310 feet, Mount Kosciuszko is the highest mountain on the Australian mainland. Even taller are Mawson Peak at 2,745 meters 9,006 feet on the remote Australian external territory of Heard Island, and, in the Australian Antarctic Territory, Mount McClintock and Mount Menzies, at 3,492 meters 11,457 feet and 3,355 meters 11,007 feet respectively. 158. Eastern Australia is marked by the Great Dividing Range, which runs parallel to the coast of Queensland, New South Wales and much of Victoria. The name is not strictly accurate, because parts of the range consist of low hills, and the highlands are typically no more than 1,600 meters 5,200 feet in height. 159 The coastal uplands and a belt of brigalow grasslands lie between the coast and the mountains, while inland of the dividing range are large areas of grassland and shrubland. 159-160 These include the western plains of New South Wales, and the Mitchell Grass Downs and Mulga lands of inland Queensland. 161-162, 163, 164, the northernmost point of the mainland is the tropical Cape York Peninsula. 150. Uluru in the semi-arid region of Central Australia. The landscapes of the top end and the Gulf country, with their tropical climate, include forest, woodland, wetland, grassland, rainforest and desert. 165, 166, 167, at the northwest corner of the continent are the sandstone cliffs and gorges of the Kimberley, and below that the Pilbara. The Victoria Plains tropical savanna lies south of the Kimberley and Arnhem Land savannas, forming a transition between the coastal savannas and the interior deserts. 168, 169, 170, at the heart of the country are the uplands of Central Australia. Prominent features of the centre and south include Uluru, also known as Ayers Rock, the famous sandstone monolith, and the inland Simpson, Terrari and Sturt Stony, Gibson, Great Sandy, Tanami, and Great Victoria deserts, with the famous Nullarbor Plain on the southern coast. 171, 172, 173, 174, the Western Australian mulga shrublands lie between the interior deserts and Mediterranean climate southwest Australia. 173, 175. Basic geological regions of Australia, by age. Lying on the Indo-Australian plate, the mainland of Australia is the lowest and most primordial landmass on Earth with a relatively stable geological history. 176-177 The landmass includes virtually all known rock types and from all geological time periods spanning over 3.8 billion years of the Earth's history. The Pilbara Craton is one of only two pristine Archean 3.6-2.7 billion years ago crusts identified on the Earth. 178. Having been part of all major supercontinents, the Australian continent began to form after the breakup of Gondwana in the Permian, with the separation of the continental landmass from the African continent and Indian subcontinent. It separated from Antarctica over a prolonged period beginning in the Permian and continuing through to the Cretaceous. 179. When the last glacial period ended in about 10,000 BC, rising sea levels formed Bass Strait, separating Tasmania from the mainland. Then between about 8,000 and 6,500 BC, the lowlands in the north were flooded by the sea, separating New Guinea, the Aru Islands, and the mainland of Australia. 180. The Australian continent is moving toward Eurasia at the rate of 6 to 7 centimeters a year. 181. The Australian mainland's continental crust, excluding the thinned margins, has an average thickness of 38 kilometers, with a range in thickness from 24 kilometers to 59 kilometers. 182. Australia's geology can be divided into several main sections, showcasing that the continent grew from west to east. The Archean cratonic shields found mostly in the west, Proterozoic fold belts in the center and Phanerozoic sedimentary basins, metamorphic and igneous rocks in the east. 183. The Australian mainland and Tasmania are situated in the middle of the tectonic plate and have no active volcanoes. 184. But due to passing over the East Australia hotspot, recent volcanism has occurred during the Holocene, in the newer volcanics province of Western Victoria and southeastern South Australia. Volcanism also occurs in the island of New Guinea, considered geologically as part of the Australian continent, and in the Australian external territory of Heard Island and McDonald Islands. 185. Seismic activity in the Australian mainland and Tasmania is also low, with the greatest number of fatalities having occurred in the 1989 Newcastle earthquake. 186. The climate of Australia is significantly influenced by ocean currents, including the Indian Ocean Dipole and the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which is correlated with periodic drought, and the seasonal tropical low-pressure system that produces cyclones in northern Australia. 188-189. These factors cause rainfall to vary markedly from year to year. Much of the northern part of the country has a tropical, predominantly summer rainfall monsoon. 153. The southwest corner of the country has a Mediterranean climate. 190. The southeast ranges from oceanic Tasmania and coastal Victoria to humid subtropical upper half of New South Wales, with the highlands featuring alpine and subpolar oceanic climates. The interior is arid to semi-arid. 153. Driven by climate change, average temperatures have risen more than 1 degree Celsius since 1960. Associated changes in rainfall patterns and climate extremes exacerbate existing issues such as drought and bushfires. 2019 was Australia's warmest recorded year, 191, and the 2019-2020 bushfire season was the country's worst on record. 192. Australia's greenhouse gas emissions per capita are among the highest in the world. 193. Water restrictions are frequently in place in many regions and cities of Australia in response to chronic shortages due to urban population increases and localized drought. 194-195. Throughout much of the continent, major flooding regularly follows extended periods of drought, flushing out inland river systems, overflowing dams and inundating large inland floodplains, as occurred throughout eastern Australia in the early 2010s after the 2000s Australian drought. 196. The koala and the eucalyptus form an iconic Australian pair. Although most of Australia is semi-arid or desert, the continent includes a diverse range of habitats from alpine heaths to tropical rainforests. Fungi typify that diversity. An estimated 250,000 species, of which only 5% have been described, occur in Australia. 197. Because of the continent's great age, extremely variable weather patterns, and long-term geographic isolation, much of Australia's biota is unique. About 85% of flowering plants, 84% of mammals, more than 45% of birds, and 89% of inshore, temperate zone fish are endemic. 198. Australia has at least 755 species of reptile, more than any other country in the world. 199. Besides Antarctica, Australia is the only continent that developed without feline species. Feral cats may have been introduced in the 17th century by Dutch shipwrecks, and later in the 18th century by European settlers. They are now considered a major factor in the decline and extinction of many vulnerable and endangered native species. 200. Seafaring immigrants from Asia are believed to have brought the dingo to Australia sometime after the end of the last ice age, perhaps 4,000 years ago. An Aboriginal people helped disperse them across the continent as pets, contributing to the demise of thylacines on the mainland. 201. Australia is also one of 17 megadiverse countries. 202. Australian forests are mostly made up of evergreen species, particularly eucalyptus trees in the less arid regions. Wattles replace them as the dominant species in drier regions and deserts. 203. Among well-known Australian animals are the monotremes, the platypus and echidna, a host of marsupials, including the kangaroo, koala, and wombat, and birds such as the emu and the kookaburra. 203. Australia is home to many dangerous animals, including some of the most venomous snakes in the world. 204. The dingo was introduced by Austronesian people who traded with indigenous Australians around 3000 BCE. 205 Many animal and plant species became extinct soon after first human settlement, 206 including the Australian megafauna, others have disappeared since European settlement, among them the thylacine. 207 208 Many of Australia's ecoregions, and the species within those regions, are threatened by human activities and introduced animal, chromiston, fungal and plant species. 209 All these factors have led to Australia's having the highest mammal extinction rate of any country in the world. 210 The Federal Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act 1999 is the legal framework for the protection of threatened species. 211 Numerous protected areas have been created under the National Strategy for the Conservation of Australia's Biological Diversity to protect and preserve unique ecosystems. 212 213 65 wetlands are listed under the Ramsar Convention. 214 and 16 Natural World Heritage Sites have been established. 215 Australia was ranked 21st out of 178 countries in the world on the 2018 Environmental Performance Index. 216 There are more than 1,800 animals and plants on Australia's threatened species list, including more than 500 animals. 217 Paleontologists discovered a fossil site of a prehistoric rainforest in McGrath's Flat, in South Australia, that presents evidence that this now arid desert and dry shrubland grassland was once home to an abundance of life. 218 219 Australia is a federal parliamentary constitutional monarchy. 220 The country has maintained a stable liberal democratic political system under its constitution, which is one of the world's oldest, since federation in 1901. It is also one of the world's oldest federations, in which power is divided between the federal and state and territorial governments. The Australian system of government combines elements derived from the political systems of the United Kingdom, a fused executive, constitutional monarchy and strong party discipline, and the United States federalism, a written constitution and strong bicameralism with an elected upper house along with distinctive indigenous features. 221 222 In the Senate, the upper house, there are 76 senators, 12 each from the states and 2 each from the mainland territories, the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory. 228 The House of Representatives, the lower house, has 151 members elected from single-member electoral divisions, commonly known as electorates, or seats, allocated to states on the basis of population, 229 with each original state guaranteed a minimum of 5 seats. 230 Elections for both chambers are normally held every 3 years simultaneously. Senators have overlapping 6-year terms except for those from the territories, whose terms are not fixed but are tied to the electoral cycle for the lower house, thus only 40 of the 76 places in the Senate are put to each election unless the cycle is interrupted by a double dissolution. 228 Australia's electoral system uses preferential voting for all lower house elections with the exception of Tasmania and the ACT, which, along with the Senate and most state upper houses, combine it with proportional representation in a system known as the single transferable vote. Voting is compulsory for all enrolled citizens 18 years and over in every jurisdiction. 231 As is enrollment. 232 The party with majority support in the House of Representatives forms the government and its leader becomes Prime Minister. In cases where no party has majority support, the Governor-General has the constitutional power to appoint the Prime Minister and, if necessary, dismiss one that has lost the confidence of Parliament. 233 Due to the relatively unique position of Australia operating as a Westminster parliamentary democracy with an elected upper house, the system has sometimes been referred to as having a Washminster mutation. 234 Or as a semi-parliamentary system. 235 There are 2 major political groups that usually form government, federally and in the states, the Australian Labor Party and the Coalition, which is a formal grouping of the Liberal Party and its minor partner, the National Party. 236-237 The Liberal National Party and the Country Liberal Party are merged state branches in Queensland and the Northern Territory that function as separate parties at a federal level. 238 Within Australian political culture, the Coalition is considered centre-right and the Labor Party is considered centre-left. 239 Independent members and several minor parties have achieved representation in Australian parliaments, mostly in upper houses. The Australian Greens are often considered the third force in politics, being the third largest party by both vote and membership. 240-241 The most recent federal election was held on the 21st of May 2022 and resulted in the Australian Labor Party, led by Anthony Albanese, being elected to government. 242 A map of Australia's states and territories. Australia has 6 states: New South Wales, NSW, Queensland, QLD, South Australia, SA, Tasmania, TUSH, Victoria, VIC, and Western Australia, WA, and 3 mainland territories, the Australian Capital Territory, ACT, the Northern Territory, NT, and the Jervis Bay Territory, JBT. The ACT and NT are mostly self-governing, except that the Commonwealth Parliament has the power to modify or repeal any legislation passed by the territory parliaments. 243 Under the Constitution, the states essentially have plenary legislative power to legislate on any subject, whereas the Commonwealth Federal Parliament may legislate only within the subject areas enumerated under Section 51. For example, state parliaments have the power to legislate with respect to education, criminal law and state police, health, transport, and local government, but the Commonwealth Parliament does not have any specific power to legislate in these areas. 244. However, Commonwealth laws prevail over state laws to the extent of the inconsistency. 245. Each state and major mainland territory has its own parliament, unicameral in the Northern Territory, the ACT in Queensland, and bicameral in the other states. The states are sovereign entities, although subject to certain powers of the Commonwealth as defined by the Constitution. The lower houses are known as the Legislative Assembly, the House of Assembly in South Australia and Tasmania. The upper houses are known as the Legislative